I'm excited to be here with a friend. My name is Brenda Kirk, and I'm a mobilizer for the South Central region covering Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas for a program within the National Immigration Forum called Bibles, Badges, and Business. And that's really what it sounds like. I work with faith leaders, I work with law enforcement, and I work with businesses to look at immigration from a perspective of the Bible, from a perspective of community safety, and from a perspective of economic reality. And so I am thrilled to have an opportunity to introduce you to my guest this afternoon. And Maria and I have known each other for quite some time. Maria Banos Jordan, is the president and founder of the Texas Familia Council. And Maria is a powerful force in our communities. And so I'm just going to open it up, Maria, and ask you to tell a little bit about who you are and how you got to where you are, and talk to us a little bit about the council.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brenda, for having me today. And I'm honored, very honored to be your first guest. That's amazing. Thank you. My council was founded in 2011 as a response to the 2010 census, which is hard to believe. It's been 10 years, but that census was pivotal in affirming what those of us that had been working in communities for a long time had already known, which was our Latino population was growing and had grown tremendously. And it had grown outside of traditional communities, which were inner city communities. It was growing in rural communities across the nation, and communities that had never had immigrant populations before. So these were the first generations encountering the existing receiving community. And while we saw it as an opportunity to open conversation about community in general and how do we build stronger communities together, we also understood that we were facing a lot of barriers. And for some communities in Texas and beyond, it was the first time they were facing these challenges in integrating and connecting across cultures. So the Texas Familias Council brought together respected Latino leaders who had been working in the local community in different sectors for a while, and who had been working alongside with me in some efforts we had undertaken locally. And we put our heads together and came up with this beautiful mission of strengthening families and inspiring inclusive communities. Because for us, the family is sacred and it's the center of society. So our work takes on many roles, including disaster recovery and response, which we'll talk about. But at the center of it all is, how do we make sure we protect and support the value of these families?
So, Maria, being a first generation American, tell me a little bit about your family history.
My parents were both immigrants, and they arrived in the U.S. about the same time, but from different countries, so they didn't know each other. My mother was from Mexico, and my father from Cuba, and so they had very different reasons for coming. The Cuban Revolution was underway, and my father was a young man escaping the communist regime, where my mother was looking for a dream that had been unfulfilled for a young Mexican woman. And she really had heard all these amazing things about the US and wanted to be part of it. And to put it into context, this was at the time of civil rights. Mm-hmm. So 1961, they arrived in the US, and they ended up in Houston, met, fell in love, got married, and had 3 kids. But their journey really has shaped and guided every step that I've taken, not just because of them being immigrants and having to go through the challenges of segregation, of bigotry, of just not understanding the history of what that was in the U.S., but also because I and my generation, we were a product of the civil rights movement. We were supposed to be the fulfillment of the dream, and so everything I've done out of respect for my parents' journey and out of respect for all the other uh, immigrants that have come and continue to come to this nation. So, so that's kind of my background, and I've both experienced the inner city barrio culture as well as the suburban and transitional community culture growing up. Houston was in its oil boom at the time, and so it was growing, and families were moving out of the inner city and into different communities where they hadn't been. And so that experience very much prepared me for what I do today. And continues to guide, like I said, the all the work that we do in helping and supporting and protecting the journey of the immigrant.
So, what has been the main concern that you have for Latino communities, and help us understand a little bit about the demographics of the communities you serve?
My work has been concentrated in Montgomery County, which is the county just north of Harris County where Houston sits. So uh, up until 1990, the census showed that there was only 7% Latino population in Montgomery County. So it had been a very predominantly white Anglo population up until that point, very homogenous. And it sits right next to the most diverse city in the nation, which is Houston. So when I walked into the community 13 years ago, the demographics had already changed quite a bit, and so we were at, I think, about at 23% Latino, 5% African American. So I was watching the transition take place as I was working in the community, and today it is close to 30% Latino. And the Montgomery County, just like all the outlying counties of Houston, receive a lot of the populations that can no longer afford to live in the city. So they're looking for a lifestyle that's more peaceful for their families to thrive in. But they're also walking into communities that had not had a history of immigrant populations before. So the resources are thinner, and there is a disconnect between, a lot of the cultures.
Mm.
So that's kind of in a nutshell. It is also a very young community. So the Latino population in Montgomery County, the majority of it is under 40, and it includes that first generation of home-born and raised Latinos that have basically come of age without representation or a lot of Latino mentorship, which is why we felt the council was so important.
That's great. I recently was asked how I viewed immigrants, and the reality is that right now they make up a large portion of those that we identify as essential workers. And I really think that makes them heroes. We know that 1 in 5 workers in Texas is an immigrant. We also know that they are in critical jobs across this nation, comprising about 17% of the healthcare workforce. 78% of farm workers are immigrants, and a large number of those are undocumented immigrants. And as we see right now, food is such a national security issue,
Yeah.
and we don't often think of those employees that work the fields. And we also recognize that over 20% of those working in transportation that are shipping goods across the country are immigrant workers, and about 14% are working in retail. And this is just a few of the many, many, many different sectors in which immigrants are carrying a large percentage of the responsibility for making sure that this country keeps operating. Uh, I encourage people to learn more about the immigrants and their work histories and careers, and encourage them to go to the National Immigration Forum's website and look on resources and then look for fact sheets. And really, you can find information about virtually every industry and oftentimes state specific information, which is also very useful. I think information keeps us grounded in the reality as opposed to what we think. Uh, anyway, I think we're at a pivotal moment where we could really see some attitudes change. And I'm just wondering if you're seeing any change in attitudes uh, in the systems and institutions that you've been working with that really provide support for the progress of immigrants and ethnic populations in your community.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think going back to your previous question, as far as our concern, obviously, the journey of the immigrant and even of our ethnic populations is way too dominated by the political narrative,
Mm-hmm.
when it shouldn't be. It is a human narrative. It is an American narrative, and so the success of all these communities, as we're seeing today, because of what you mentioned, the necessity of the different components of our systems, right, of our basic needs systems, are dependent on these workers, on this labor force, on these human beings that work very, very hard with a very strong work ethic to make sure that not only their families have what's needed, but that their communities have what's needed. And so the civic disengagement, the lack of representation, and the, I guess, the harm to the psyche that does
Mm-hmm.
for these communities is devastating to me and those of us that work in this work. So, nurturing that sense of self and belonging is very important to us. And we definitely try to educate and guide our partners, our peers, to understand why we feel this way. So the systems and the institutions tend to be very stubborn and very hard to change and update. And they are politically driven too often. So we have a lot to work against, that's working against us in trying to shape this narrative in a different way. But I have seen progress. I mean, again, being a daughter of immigrants, I've seen the progress from when their journey began to my journey today. But the frustration continues to be that I continue to see the very same barriers in place that they faced, 60 years ago, that continue to rise again, because we're not oftentimes learning the lessons of history. We are repeating them in different ways that hold back or hold down the human spirit. So yes, I mean, I've seen more awareness, certainly in academic circles. There's a lot more discussion and study and research on these things, but how that plays out in the real world at the grassroots level is where we see the real problems. So getting information into communities, connecting with family systems, because as you know, for traditional cultures, the family is the center. And so if you're not speaking to the family, whereas our American identity is very focused around the individual, our traditional cultures really are based around the family unit, and even the community. So what hurts one or what affects one affects all. And so trying to get some of our systems to understand that perspective and do their outreach, through that lens is it's coming along, but we still have a long way to go.
Yeah, always. Uh, from your perspective, what is the most difficult barrier to overcome when working between cultures and community?
I would say working within that space, between that actual space, which sometimes is a physical, sometimes it's a spiritual or an intellectual space. Um, where that distrust
Hmm.
enters and where the disconnect happens, where we don't want to feel vulnerable, so we refuse to walk into that space. That's the space where I find real change can happen. That's where we do our work. That's where I mostly exist, because I mean, we can superficially pretend that that we're working together, that we're, fully integrated and respecting each other. And I think largely we've done very good at pretending a lot of that. But until we actually connect with communities and people on a personal level and are able to be empathetic and vulnerable to learning and not assuming that I know more than you, until we were able to reach that point, we can't really bring change about. So I would say that's the most difficult thing, the most difficult place to work within, and the most difficult thing to try to teach people, especially in today's environment where people have been so divided by rhetoric and distrust.
Yeah. Well, uh, I nabbed these pictures, and I love this that you and your volunteers are hand in hand serving the community. I think it's important when we think about change makers that change makers don't happen from an ivory tower. They work in community, they build trust, and I love these pictures to see you out working in food distribution in your community. And I know this is happening all over the country right now. We see pictures of cars lined up forever. So this is a more country version of the big lines. And so
Yeah.
just talk to me a little bit about what you're doing and the volunteers that you're working with in this work today.
Sure. So like every other community organization, we've had to shift our work, our objectives, because, and not just because of coronavirus. I mean, remember, we've obviously been hit by other disasters here regionally that have tremendously affected and changed our landscape. But we're having to learn to adapt quickly to these things, and unfortunately, that puts some of our more, intensive undertakings on the back burner for now. But what we're learning to do is to weave some of those goals into the work that we're doing currently. So hopefully, we'll be able to hit multiple goals with one stone. But here recently, as a response to coronavirus, because of the health concerns and the economic hit that these communities, especially these frontline communities that are the ones that work in the service sector, the ones that are essential workers, they felt the hit pretty much within the first or second week of the coronavirus impact. And so they are struggling and they are in fear. And so we quickly are working with some of our partners here in Montgomery County with the food bank and Abundant Harvest Kitchen, who is a wonderful partner, to organize these car lines of food for I think last week we had about 250 families or cars, and we're distributing fresh, good produce and food for them to get them through week by week as much as we can. It's hard right now, and I know you want to talk a little bit about compassion fatigue. Especially for us, that we are a volunteer-driven organization. We rely on our partnerships and our volunteers, and so yeah, that's going to determine how we are able to effectively reach some of the basic needs of our communities.
Yeah, I think it's important. So for people who are not from Texas or don't know this region, this community that you were working in was hit both by Hurricane Harvey and then last year, late last fall, Tropical Storm Imelda, which devastated so much of that service area that you're working in. And I really do wonder how these families are faring and how they're maintaining. And just the level of compassion fatigue that you
Yes.
see.
Um, the immigrant communities are driven by an immense amount of hope
Mhm.
that is so embedded in their identity. It is what gets them through the worst of hardships. It makes them extremely resourceful, but it allows them to endure the suffering, but they do go through a lot of suffering. And just like this picture here that you have, we're out in the woods. This was a meeting that we put together with some partners from the county to inform families on support available after Tropical Storm Imelda. And both storms, within a year of each other, devastated, flooded, very small villages, working class communities that didn't have the infrastructure to really sustain that type of hit. And so literally, homes washed away, and lives just kind of uprooted. So they are very fatigued, and I see it even in the food lines right now when they're coming through. And that's why I feel it's so important for us to be present, our hands and feet in the community, because I feel like while we're nourishing their bodies, we also want to help nourish their spirit, and to bring a sense of support and reassurance, even if it's just by them seeing us and having some consistency and continuity there. But on the professional side, our partners are experiencing extreme compassion fatigue. Donors are experiencing compassion fatigue. So everybody's very much stretched, and we're all taking on multiple roles and there's, it's kind of now, it has become the new normal, but it's not normal. Like there's nothing normal about what we're experiencing today. And so, I think living on the Gulf Coast, those of us that have grown up in hurricanes, as kids, it was exciting, right? It was just something that we learned to work through, and we've been hit several times. But here recently, it's just been a very different sense to what's happening and the level of fatigue it's taking, that it's impacting our families with. So I think for us, it's a matter of refocusing and recentering on our faith,
Mhm.
and continuing to nurture that faith and that hope in the communities that we serve.
That's good. Well, one of the things, several of us were talking a couple of weeks ago uh, about how could we help, and how could we really help people by sharing, for those of us who have income or have a stable financial foundation, how could we take the stimulus and redirect that to the more vulnerable populations? And just talking about it led to a pastor putting something in action. A pastor out of Tulsa launched this website, shareyourstimulus.com. And there's some great stories there, both from donors and from receivers. And so I just wanted to make the group aware of that, and say, if you don't need all of your stimulus, what a wonderful way to give back to the community. And now, Maria, I know that you're unpaid, but tell me a little bit about how your organization might receive, or where you would have donors direct their resources that would be of help to you.
Sure. So yeah, so we don't, all our work is volunteer driven. And so we rely very heavily on the support and sponsorship of partners, whether it's a community college or a local bank, or, different nonprofit organizations that work alongside us. But because we are on the ground, and because I'm continuously, trying to keep my hand on the pulse of the community and how it's faring through these things, I'm able to point in the direction when, I work very closely with FEMA when they came down. For 2 weeks, I put aside my normal routine to basically be be their point person in the field, because they understand that these communities often go unseen, and they don't get the service. So
And
so
can be
because
very
of
leery of outsiders.
Oh, absolutely. That was a big thing, and and especially with the public charge policies that have so devastated the sense of safety and well-being for our families. Those things really do make it hard to provide services that could mean life or death for
Mhm,
families.
mhm.
So I am able to help point those donations in the directions, like wonderful partners like Abundant Harvest and Community Assistance Center, some other partners that work very closely with us that actually provide the service. And people are welcome to contact me personally, get on our website, texasfamiliascouncil.org, and reach me, and we can have that conversation if you're interested in providing some financial support or volunteer your time.
Yeah, and volunteers are so critical, and I think it's one of the ways that we can really put hands and feet to the work. There's nothing more rewarding than volunteering and knowing that you've helped others. Likewise, I think the volunteer gains as much from the process as those that are receiving support.
Oh,
And so I
absolutely.
really encourage community to think about find those organizations that are really doing the frontline work and figure out how you can volunteer your time and contribute to that community.
Absolutely. And I'll just add to that, that you and I've talked about this many times over the years. It is hard returning back to memories that were painful of either
Mm.
poverty or struggle that a lot of our parents went through, or that we watched other people go through it through our childhood. And once we move beyond that, it's hard to return to that.
Mhm.
But part of our growth, I think, as human beings comes from that ability to do that and
Yes.
to learn. And I feel like I am constantly learning by walking into the community and understanding someone's struggle and perspective and their hope. And so, like you said, it's extremely rewarding in ways that really can't be measured. So definitely, I think volunteerism at the grassroots level is important.
Yes. Well, I know that there are 1,001 things I wanted to ask, and I've probably missed some of them. So, one of the things that we've talked about before is really helping communities engage in that civic identity, whether it's completing the census or registering to vote or engaging in a public career.
Mhm.
Uh, Tell me a little bit about the work that you all have done and helping people move forward with citizenship and just various things that you're doing.
Yeah, so it's very important to us that even though, I don't really consider ourselves a direct service provider, but yet we do, because just like now with a crisis or a disaster, we literally have to step onto the front line. And because there's so many gaps in services, especially for our immigrant or our vulnerable communities, whether it be our aging populations, um, there are so many gaps that we often end up having to improvise and create programs and initiatives in order to make those resources connect directly to the people. And so over the years, we've undertaken several grassroots efforts. Here you have a picture of a couple of gentlemen studying for the citizenship classes, citizenship exam. So we've been able to make those resources available to communities, ESL, healthcare, providing immunizations, connecting leaders to the communities that they serve. We forget that sometimes a lot of our elected officials don't have the time or forget to step into these communities because maybe they don't know who to begin to talk to or how to begin that conversation. But it's so, so fundamental that local leaders understand their communities from the inside. And so we've had forums to make that happen, law enforcement to help ease some of the fear, because when there are negative immigration policies that affect people's communities, especially communities that have mixed status families, which all our communities do now, um, that terror can really affect a person's sense of safety, especially if they see crime in their communities or if they're experiencing domestic violence. So we try to work closely with law enforcement, and there are just some amazing, beautiful souls that are peace officers that want to have that connection still with the communities despite all the political rhetoric. So we try to be that bridge for that to happen. So over these 10 years, we've amassed quite a bit of work in communities just because the need was there, and thankfully we were blessed with, very brilliant and wonderful volunteers that have helped along the way.
Well, I think it's important that people trust that you have their best interests at heart, and that doesn't come easily or quickly. And so staying the course for the long haul is really paying dividends in Montgomery County. I can see it even over the few years that I've been doing this work, that changes in attitudes. You and I did a living room conversation in Conroe last fall,
Yeah.
and I think right before Imelda hit,
Yes.
and just had a wonderful opportunity with representatives from Lone Star Community College and NAACP and the faith community and business leaders and service organizations, really just talking about, what does it mean to be an immigrant in Conroe, Texas, and what what can we do to make it a more civil engagement for everyone? And I think, I'm always thrilled when I can find a local leader that has the passion and has the connections in communities that we might not know about, like Deerwood. Your work there has been long and very impactful, and so I thank you, Maria, for all that you've done. I think you're one of our heroes.
Well, thank you so much, Brenda. And thank you for being a constant light to bring these issues to the forefront. Because you're right, it's about the marathon, it's the long haul. And I think that that's one of the disadvantages of immigrant communities is they don't have enough advocates that are able or sometimes willing to face some of the heat or some of the backlash. But when it's a personal mission, it becomes a vocation, right? And so you're in it for as long as God wills it. And
Yes.
so I think these conversations that you host are beautiful in the sense that they do arouse and I remember that it arouses in every member around that table those memories, those personal experiences that they themselves sometimes have pushed away somewhere.
Yeah.
Um, and even though they're involved in the work, it deepens the connection for them by having that conversation outwardly
Yes.
instead of just in their mind. And so they're very, very beneficial. And I think that with Deerwood, which is a rural community, one of the oldest Latino communities that I have found in Montgomery County, we spent 8 years. we try to replicate elements of that, like what we're doing in East Montgomery County right now with that New Caney community that we're serving, to bring their hopes and dreams to the forefront and help shape efforts around that. Because I feel very strongly it's not about us imposing our views on a community or telling them what they need. It's about us listening and hearing and helping bring our gifts to them so that they can begin to develop their own community how they know how to do it. I think what we oftentimes forget with immigrant populations is how many gifts they have
Mhm.
internally that have not been tapped or used. And so by us being present, we're able to help them begin to use that.
And I think about the resiliency that they can teach a lot of us
Yeah.
who have had soft and easy lives.
Yep.
Their resiliency is amazing.
Yes, I agree 100%.
The opportunity we've had together today, and know that you will always be in my heart. And anytime I can be of assistance, please call on me.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brenda, again for being such an advocate for all our families. This is tough work. I think it has to be in your DNA to some extent. I think you have to have that call, but it's connecting to beautiful people like yourself that we are continuously reminded of the purpose and that we are not alone in this work. So thank you and many blessings on your work going forward.
All right. Bye bye.
Bye. Thank you.